My sister tried to tear my newborn from my arms in front of hospital nurses, then filed a CPS report accusing my husband of assaulting her. When I begged her to stop calling herself Mama at the hospital, she smiled and said, "He's Levi. He knows who I am. You were just the vessel." I didn't respond. That was 18 months ago. Last night, she stood outside our new home in the rain, cradling a doll and whispering lullabies to it like it could hear her. My sister Evelyn was 7 months pregnant with what she called her miracle baby when she was drugged and assaulted by one of her closest male friends. She regained consciousness 12 hours later, her stomach flat, bruising between her legs, dried blood down her thighs. The man received a suspended sentence and walked free. 18 months ago, I became pregnant, and Evelyn convinced herself her miracle boy had returned to life in my womb. She showed up at the hospital while I was in labor, carrying falsified documents claiming she was a surrogate, that I wasn't the mother, just a host. Our parents stood right beside her, backing her up. Evelyn tried physically to rip my baby from my arms when the nurses wouldn't listen to her. For the next week, she visited daily, calling herself Mama in front of everyone. She took hundreds of photos and plastered them online, claiming Levi as her own. It became so suffocating I had to block her. She retaliated by filing a false report with CPS. When the caseworker visited our home, Evelyn arrived uninvited with our parents. "We're concerned too," they said. Evelyn had gone so far as to paint a black eye on her face with makeup. "Her husband did this to me," she told the worker. "But I didn't press charges because he was drunk. He didn't mean it." The worker summoned my husband and me for a formal interview. Meanwhile, Levi was placed in Evelyn's custody during the investigation. I lived in terror every moment, imagining our child being taken for good. 2 weeks later, we were cleared. My husband and I went to Evelyn's house and found Levi nearly unresponsive in his crib. My husband had to physically hold Evelyn back while I rushed to scoop Levi into my arms. He instinctively clung to me, burying his face in my chest. Evelyn screamed, "I'm going to get him back." 7 days later, I was woken by an alert from the nanny cam in our daughter's room. Evelyn was there, holding Levi, who was already crying. She had used a spare key I forgot she still had. She was humming a lullaby and whispering, "Mommy's here." When I half whispered, half yelled at her to stop, she told me to be quiet, or I'd wake Josh. Not Levi Josh, the name of the son she believed she was meant to have years ago. She only handed Levi back when I told her I was calling the police. My husband and I went straight to court and filed for a restraining order. The judge denied it. "No credible threat of violence," he said. Our parents' testimony on Evelyn's behalf didn't help. Evelyn's husband filed for divorce after seeing the nanny cam footage played in court. She blamed us. "You turned him against me. You stole my husband, just like you stole my baby." By the time the divorce was finalized, Evelyn had spent months scheming. She convinced our mother to make a copy of the keys to our new house. One night, she used them to silently break in. I woke up at 5 a.m. to an empty crib. Panic surged through me like never before. I tore through the nanny footage and immediately called 911. An Amber Alert and a medical emergency notice were issued. Those next few days were agonizing. Levi had an autoimmune disorder. My breast milk was the only thing keeping him alive. He had survived during the CPS investigation only because I had handed Evelyn every bottle I'd pumped. Now he had nothing. 72 hours later, the police called. They'd found Evelyn in an apartment 2 states away. Levi was critically ill, severely dehydrated, and his organs were beginning to shut down. He was airlifted to the nearest hospital. The doctors told us they couldn't promise he'd survive. While Levi was in the PICU, Evelyn underwent a psychiatric evaluation. Investigators searched her apartment and found fake documents, a falsified birth certificate, forged custody paperwork naming her as Levi's mother, even a fabricated social security number. She had told her landlord months prior that she'd be gaining custody of her sister's baby. She was laying the foundation for her fantasy all along, claiming she'd rescued a child from a neglectful mother. And while Levi fought for his life, our parents hired Evelyn the best lawyer they could find, hoping to get her off on some technicality. The lawyer my parents hired for Evelyn was Charles Reddington, a man notorious for exploiting loopholes in child endangerment cases. I found out when I overheard my mother on the phone with his office arranging payment plans. She was standing right outside Sam's hospital room, completely unaware I was down the hall, as she calmly discussed how they could frame Evelyn's actions as a mental health episode instead of abduction. I walked past her without a word and went back to Sam's room. The machines beeped in rhythm around his tiny body, monitoring each fragile heartbeat and breath. The doctors had stabilized him, but he was still critically weak. His once warm, pink complexion had faded into a ghostly gray that made my chest ache every time I looked at him. My husband sat slumped in the corner chair, hollow-eyed after 3 sleepless nights. He had been documenting everything, each medical update, every conversation with the staff, every sign of Sam's slow recovery. We both knew Evelyn wasn't finished, and we'd need undeniable proof of what her obsession had done to our child. The next morning, a social worker named Maribel arrived. She introduced herself as part of the hospital's family services team, but something felt off from the moment she entered the room. She asked strangely loaded questions about our home environment, our parenting style, and whether we had considered that Evelyn might have had legitimate concerns about Sam's well-being. I watched my husband's jaw lock when Maribel suggested that perhaps we could benefit from family mediation with Evelyn. She pulled out forms requesting our consent to facilitate joint meetings. My husband got up, walked calmly to the door, and held it open. Maribel quietly gathered her things and stepped out, though not before informing us she could return with a court order if necessary. That afternoon, while I was expressing milk for Sam's feeding tube, my phone started buzzing with alerts. Evelyn had launched a full-blown social media campaign. She uploaded carefully curated photos from her time with Sam, cropped just enough to hide any visible signs of his declining health. The captions spun a narrative of a devoted aunt forced to take desperate measures to protect her nephew from negligent parents. The comment sections were overflowing with support from people who didn't know the truth. Strangers offered donations, pledged to start legal defense fundraisers, even called her a hero. I screenshotted everything before blocking her new accounts, but more just kept popping up. She had clearly planned this, creating dozens of backup profiles in advance. That evening, my daughter, who had been staying with my in-laws during the crisis, called me in tears. Kids at school were asking her if it was true what the other moms were saying on Facebook, that we were bad parents, that Evelyn was the one saving Levi from us. In our small town, gossip spreads like wildfire. And Evelyn's version of the story of a grieving, misunderstood woman trying to rescue a baby was quickly taking hold. 2 days later, Sam was finally stable enough to begin weaning off some of the machines. I held him for the first time since the abduction, and he wrapped his frail fingers around mine, holding on with what little strength he had left. That's when my father appeared in the doorway. He stood there silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he told me Evelyn needed help, not punishment. He said we were tearing the family apart by pressing charges. When I reminded him that Sam nearly died, he shook his head and said we were being dramatic. Evelyn had told him Sam was perfectly fine when she had him, that the hospital was exaggerating his condition to strengthen our legal case. My husband came back from the cafeteria to find my father lecturing me about loyalty and family unity. Without speaking, he stepped between us and quietly asked my father to leave. As he walked out, my father mumbled something about how we'd regret turning our backs on family when we needed them most. The results of Evelyn's psychiatric evaluation came in later that week. She was diagnosed with delusional disorder persecutory type, with strong elements of grandiosity. The psychiatrist wrote that she genuinely believed Sam was her deceased child reborn, and that everyone keeping them apart was part of an elaborate conspiracy. Charles Reddington used the diagnosis as a pivot point. He began filing motions one after another, pushing for mandated treatment instead of incarceration. Each filing tried to reframe Evelyn's behavior as the result of unresolved trauma and grief-driven psychosis rather than the deliberate abduction of a child. The prosecutor warned us that juries often sympathize with defendants who plead mental illness, especially when close family members testify in their defense. My mother began coming to the hospital daily not to see Sam, but to leave gifts and handwritten notes for Evelyn in the lobby. She'd speak to anyone willing to listen about Evelyn's tragic loss years ago and how it shattered her mentally. Eventually, hospital security had to ban her from the premises after she was caught trying to sneak into the psychiatric unit to visit Evelyn. Around this time, I discovered just how far back Evelyn's planning went, long before Sam was even born. She'd been active in online forums and support groups for parents who had lost custody, absorbing their terminology and learning manipulation tactics. She had studied interstate custody laws and specifically chosen an apartment in a state with weaker extradition policies for family abduction cases. The lease for the apartment revealed even more disturbing truths. Evelyn had spent months telling neighbors about her supposed upcoming custody battle, framing herself as a dedicated mother wronged by a system that favored biological parents. She had decorated a nursery nearly identical to ours, same crib model, same sizes of clothes as Sam's, but what my husband uncovered chilled us to our core. In our home security footage from the weeks before the abduction, Evelyn could be seen testing our patterns. She'd sneak in and out while we slept, checking how long we took to respond to Sam's cries, measuring when we were in our deepest sleep. She was rehearsing for the moment she'd take him. I couldn't stop wondering about that lawyer's name, Charles Reddington. Was that really his name? Or had someone messed up the records? Either way, it didn't change what Evelyn had done, and it made me question what else she'd been doing during my pregnancy that went unnoticed. She'd done multiple dry runs breaking in and leaving without taking Sam just to perfect her timing and strategy. The prosecutor eventually showed us text messages exchanged between Evelyn and my mother during those weeks. My own mother had been feeding her updates, our daily schedule, Sam's feeding times, even the nights we looked most sleep-deprived. She played a direct role in planning the abduction, though she insisted she thought Evelyn simply wanted to spend more time with her nephew. As Sam slowly began to recover, his weight returning, his color improving, and his grip growing stronger, the legal war grew more aggressive. Charles Reddington filed a motion to downgrade the charges from kidnapping to custodial interference, arguing that Evelyn sincerely believed she had a right to Sam. He used the falsified documents she created not as evidence of premeditation, but as proof of her detachment from reality. He portrayed her as a mentally ill woman, consumed by grief, not a criminal with intent. The prosecutor countered with hard evidence. Evelyn's online research, the fake identity she created for Sam, her calculated selection of a low-risk jurisdiction, all pointing to meticulous planning. Still, Reddington was good at his job. He spun a narrative of a grieving aunt driven to extreme measures by a cruel and cold family who had shut her out. My husband and I spent countless hours with the prosecutor, refining every line of our testimony. That's when we found out that my parents had already given depositions supporting Evelyn's version of events. They claimed we'd pushed her out, treated her cruelly, and refused to let her have a meaningful relationship with Sam, which, in their words, triggered her emotional break. But the truth was, we had tried. At the beginning, we welcomed Evelyn. We invited her to family dinners. We let her hold Sam and be part of our early days. But it all shifted when she insisted on being called Mama, when she tried to breastfeed him, when she crossed lines we never imagined needing to set. Boundaries became necessary ones she refused to accept. One night, I sat beside Sam's crib at the hospital, watching him sleep soundly for the first time in days. His breathing was even, his fingers twitching gently in dreams, and I realized how drastically everything had changed. The family I once trusted had become a danger. The sister I once whispered secrets with had become someone who viewed my child as hers to take. The parents who raised me were now enabling her to steal him. But amid the betrayal, I also saw the people who stood by us without hesitation. My husband's family had been unwavering in their support. His parents took leave from work to help with our daughter and never once suggested reconciliation. Friends from our neighborhood and town began fighting back against Evelyn's lies, launching their own social media effort to spread the truth about what really happened. As Sam's condition stabilized and his strength returned, we started planning for what lay ahead. We knew this wasn't over. Reddington had made it clear he intended to push for a plea deal, court-mandated psychiatric treatment, and no jail time. The prosecutor warned us that, given my parents' testimony and the mental health defense, a plea deal might be the best outcome we could realistically expect. Her warning proved prophetic when Charles Reddington filed his next motion petitioning for Evelyn's immediate release pending trial, citing her worsening mental state in custody. The motion included an affidavit from my parents, portraying Evelyn as a loving sister who had suffered a psychological collapse after years of unresolved trauma. I watched my husband's knuckles go pale as he clenched the side of Sam's hospital bed while reading it. The document painted us as cruel, unfeeling relatives who had refused to show compassion to a woman mourning the loss of a child she believed had been reborn. Reddington even included photos of the nursery Evelyn had prepared in her apartment, presenting them as proof of maternal instinct rather than calculated planning. Our lawyer urged us to brace ourselves. Judges, she explained, were often sympathetic to mental health claims, especially when supported by emotional appeals from family members. The idea of Evelyn walking free while Sam was still recovering from her actions made my stomach twist with dread. 3 days later, we received confirmation that a hearing had been scheduled. My parents would testify on Evelyn's behalf, alongside a psychiatrist hired by Reddington. We scrambled to pull together as much supporting evidence as we could, but the prosecutor warned that heartfelt testimony often swayed judges more than cold facts. The morning of the hearing came too fast. I kissed Sam's forehead and left him with a nurse I trusted with my life. My chest ached just being away from him. My husband squeezed my hand as we walked into the courthouse, bracing for a confrontation we both knew would be devastating. Inside, Evelyn sat beside Reddington, dressed demurely in a conservative outfit that emphasized her fragility. She'd lost weight in custody, her hair hung flat and unwashed. When she saw us, her eyes lit up, not with warmth, but something sharp and unhinged. My mother rushed to her, embracing her with whispered encouragements. My father lingered nearby, casting cold, judgmental stares in our direction. Other extended family members I hadn't seen in ages filled the benches behind Evelyn, creating a display of unity that made me feel isolated in the courtroom. Reddington began his argument with chilling precision. He called my mother first. Her voice cracked as she spoke about Evelyn's breakdown after the loss of her baby, how we'd heartlessly excluded her from Sam's life, and how that cruelty had driven her to desperation. She pleaded for the judge's compassion. My father's testimony was even more unbearable. He claimed we'd always been jealous of Evelyn, and that we'd gotten pregnant on purpose just to hurt her. He insisted her actions, though misguided, stemmed from love. He even suggested that supervised visits with Sam might help her heal. Then came the psychiatrist, who diagnosed Evelyn with a grief-induced psychotic break. He testified that she truly believed Sam was her child reborn and recommended outpatient treatment over incarceration, warning that jail would only make her condition worse. When it was our turn, the prosecutor did her best. She presented security footage of Evelyn breaking into our home, the forged documents, and digital evidence of her months-long preparation. But I could see the faces of some jurors begin to soften when Reddington responded to each point with a narrative rooted in mental illness, grief, and desperation. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When he returned, he granted Evelyn's release on bail under strict conditions. She would wear an ankle monitor, undergo mandatory psychiatric treatment, and stay away from us. My parents would serve as her court-appointed custodians, responsible for ensuring compliance. Evelyn's eyes locked on mine as the bailiff removed her cuffs. The look wasn't relief, it was strategy. I gripped my husband's arm. I knew in my gut that this wasn't over. We rushed back to the hospital, where Sam was awake and fussing for food. As I held him close, I made up my mind. We couldn't remain in this town, not with Evelyn free and our parents continuing to enable her. My husband agreed without hesitation. That night, while he searched for extended-stay hotels in nearby cities, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Sam's hospital bracelet, the one that had gone missing during the kidnapping. The message read, "He still needs his real mommy." I showed it to hospital security immediately. They increased patrols around Sam's room. Police traced the message to a burner phone bought with cash. No proof linked it directly to Evelyn, but we knew. More messages came in the following days. Photos from Evelyn's time with Sam, each captioned with disturbing affirmations of their bond. One showed him in the outfit she had bought for Josh, with a message claiming how perfect he looked in her son's clothes. We installed security software on every device, changed every password, enabled two-factor authentication. But the feeling of being watched never faded. Every trip outside the hospital felt like a risk. I found myself scanning the parking lot, hyper-aware of every unfamiliar face. A week after Evelyn's release, our daughter, still staying with my in-laws, called in tears. Someone had been leaving baby clothes on their doorstep with notes addressed to Josh's big sister. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, but the message was unmistakable. Evelyn knew where she was. My husband drove 3 hours round trip to retrieve her. I stayed behind with Sam, pacing the hospital floor, checking my phone every few minutes for news. When they finally returned, our daughter ran into my arms, trembling. "Why is Aunt Evelyn being so scary?" she asked. The police investigated, but once again found nothing directly tying the incidents to Evelyn. Without hard evidence, they couldn't arrest her for violating the restraining order. Reddington even sent a formal letter denying Evelyn's involvement and insinuating that we were being paranoid. Meanwhile, Evelyn's online campaign escalated. New accounts sprang up almost daily. She launched a blog titled A Mother's Heart, writing long, emotional posts about losing her baby and finding him again in Sam. The comments filled with sympathy and support. Some local mom groups rallied behind her, organizing meal deliveries and prayer vigils. Others quietly supported us but hesitated to speak up, afraid of the growing community divide. Every grocery run became a minefield. People whispered, some glared, others offered awkward, hushed condolences. I couldn't believe Charles Reddington was a real person. His name sounded like something someone made up while scribbling on a forged birth certificate, but there he was, transforming Evelyn's baby-stealing scheme into a redemption story faster than we could react. Then came the worst breach. One afternoon, as Sam napped in his hospital crib, a woman I didn't recognize entered the room. She introduced herself as a lactation consultant, but something felt wrong. She reached for Sam, saying she needed to check his latch. I stepped between them and called security. Turned out she was a friend of Evelyn's from one of her online support groups. She'd driven 2 hours just to meet the baby Evelyn had spoken so much about. Security removed her as she shouted about injustice and called me a baby thief who had stolen Evelyn's child. That incident changed everything. The hospital restricted access to Sam's room. Only pre-approved individuals could enter, and everyone had to present ID. The heightened security gave us some peace, but it also turned Sam's recovery space into a fortress. Then my parents began pushing harder for reconciliation. They started showing up at the hospital again, despite the restrictions, always claiming they just wanted to check on their grandson. But every visit ended the same, with pleas to let Evelyn just see Sam, insisting it would help her heal. During one particularly heated exchange, my mother broke down and told me Evelyn had been hospitalized briefly for self-harm. She blamed us. If you would just let her see him, she wouldn't have hurt herself. It was so clearly manipulative, but it still stabbed at my chest. That misplaced guilt, the one they always knew how to summon. That was the moment my husband snapped. He told my parents, in no uncertain terms, exactly what their blind loyalty had cost. Sam nearly dying. Our daughter terrified, our lives uprooted. He showed them photos of Sam in the PICU, his tiny body hooked up to machines, fighting for life because of Evelyn's actions. My father's response froze me in place. He looked at the images and said, "Evelyn must have had a reason. You must have done something to push her to such desperation." That complete refusal to acknowledge reality made one thing clear. My parents were beyond reasoning with. As Sam grew stronger, the doctors began to discuss discharge. But the thought of leaving the hospital's protection filled me with dread. Our house no longer felt safe. Even with reinforced locks and a new security system, Evelyn knew our habits, our weaknesses. She had already proven her ability to plan and wait. We made the painful choice to sell our home. My husband found a job opportunity in another state, far enough to give us a clean start, but close enough to return for court proceedings. We told no one except his parents and our closest friends, knowing any word could travel back to Evelyn through my parents. The house sold quickly, though closing would take several weeks. In the meantime, we relocated to a rental across town, keeping the address tightly guarded. Only those who absolutely needed to know had it. We created new routines, changed our habits, varied our schedules, anything to stay unpredictable. Still, Evelyn found ways to reach us. Packages began arriving, sent to our old address, then forwarded. Baby clothes, toys, items monogrammed with Josh. Each delivery was a ghostly reminder that she hadn't given up. One package disturbed us more than the rest. Inside was a baby memory book, filled out in Evelyn's handwriting. It documented Josh's supposed milestones, complete with photos from the time she had kidnapped Sam. The captions described their special moments together. The final page contained a poem, something about a mother's love defying all odds. We turned everything over to the prosecutor and police. It all went into evidence. Each item revealed someone who couldn't separate fantasy from reality, someone who would never stop believing Sam was hers. Charles Reddington continued his relentless motions, trying to reduce or dismiss charges. He argued Evelyn's mental condition made her incapable of criminal intent. He submitted letter after letter from my parents praising her character, each one more out of touch with reality than the last. Our prosecutor remained hopeful but grounded. She told us that family-related criminal cases involving mental illness rarely resulted in lengthy prison sentences. The best we might hope for was mandatory treatment with long-term supervision if we could convince the jury that Evelyn was still dangerous. The thought that Evelyn might walk away with little more than therapy enraged me. Sam had nearly died. Our daughter still woke up from nightmares about her aunt stealing her baby brother. And our entire life had been turned upside down, yet Evelyn might leave court with nothing more than a schedule of counseling sessions. As the trial approached, Evelyn's behavior escalated again. She began turning up in places she suspected we might be: our pediatrician's office, the grocery store, even the park. She never made contact, always standing just far enough away to deny any intent. But her presence was unmistakable, and it felt like a constant threat. One evening, while I was loading groceries into the trunk of our car, I saw her. Evelyn was standing across the parking lot beside a car I didn't recognize. She held a baby doll wrapped in a blanket, gently rocking it as she stared at me, unblinking, unsettling. I called the police, but she vanished before they arrived. The toll on our family was immense. Our daughter became fearful, clinging to us constantly, afraid to be out of sight. My husband stopped sleeping. He spent his nights pacing, checking cameras and door locks on repeat. I couldn't go anywhere without scanning my surroundings, jumping at shadows. Even Sam started to show signs. He became restless, harder to soothe. His weight gain plateaued, worrying the doctors. Tests found no physical cause. They said he was reacting to the stress around him. Then, 3 weeks before the trial, we were hit with crushing news. Reddington had successfully petitioned for a competency evaluation. He claimed Evelyn was not mentally fit to stand trial. If the evaluation supported that claim, the entire case could be put on hold indefinitely while Evelyn underwent treatment. The prosecutor explained that this was a common defense strategy in cases involving mental illness. If Evelyn were declared incompetent, she'd be sent to a psychiatric facility until doctors deemed her fit to stand trial, a process that could stretch on for months, possibly even years. In the meantime, she'd receive more comprehensive care than prison would ever offer. When we heard the news, my husband slammed his fist against the table. All our evidence, every hour of preparation, it could all be derailed if Evelyn convinced evaluators that she didn't understand the charges. Charles Reddington had found yet another loophole to help her dodge accountability. We attended the competency hearing and watched as Evelyn leaned fully into her delusions. She called Sam Josh throughout the proceedings, insisting she didn't understand why she was being separated from her baby. She cried over missing his first words, his first steps, milestones she had only imagined for the son she lost years ago. The evaluators asked her clear, direct questions about the charges. Evelyn responded with wide-eyed confusion, saying she had only tried to bring her child home. When questioned about the forged documents, she claimed they were authentic, that someone must have swapped them out to set her up. The scariest part was how believable she made it all seem. Her delusions were disturbingly consistent. My parents testified too, reinforcing her performance. They told the evaluators that Evelyn had been calling Sam Josh for months, that she truly couldn't tell the difference between her deceased child and her nephew. Their statements made it harder for the evaluators to dismiss Evelyn's claims as manipulation. After 3 days of testimony and evaluation, we waited with pounding hearts. When the lead evaluator finally presented her findings, I felt my breath catch. Evelyn was deemed competent to stand trial. Yes, she suffered from delusional disorder, but she understood the charges and was capable of participating in her own defense. The trial would proceed. For just a moment, Evelyn's mask cracked. As the ruling was read, a flash of fury crossed her face, quick but unmistakable, before she returned to her fragile, bewildered act. Reddington immediately filed an appeal. The judge denied it. We would finally get our day in court. The remaining weeks blurred together in a haze of final preparations and ongoing stress. Evelyn's supporters grew louder, organizing small protests outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Mental illness isn't a crime," and "Justice for Evelyn." Local news stations picked up the story, and we found ourselves ducking cameras and reporters whenever we left the house. My parents spoke to anyone who would listen. They gave interviews, painting us as cold-hearted family members who had driven their daughter to mental collapse. They even shared old photos, family picnics, holidays, crafting a narrative that made it look like we'd betrayed some picture-perfect bond. The lies made my stomach turn, as if we had chosen this nightmare, as if we wanted our lives to unravel. But through it all, we stayed focused on what mattered, keeping our children safe and preparing to face Evelyn in court. We rehearsed our testimony until we could deliver it through tears, through exhaustion, without faltering. We gathered witnesses who had seen Evelyn's behavior firsthand. We documented every violation of the restraining order, every threatening message, every unwanted appearance. The night before the trial began, I lay in bed holding Sam against my chest. His breathing had steadied again. His weight had returned to a healthy level. He was physically healing, but I still wondered, would some part of him remember those terrifying days? Would there be some lasting trace of what Evelyn had put him through? My husband wrapped his arms around both of us and whispered promises into the dark, that soon it would all be over, that we would share our story, the jury would understand, and Evelyn would finally face justice, that we could move forward. And I wanted to believe him, but I also knew the truth wasn't that simple. Even with a conviction, Evelyn would still exist somewhere out there, anchored to a fantasy that Sam was hers. My parents would continue to support her, and our community would remain fractured, caught between truth and illusion. Reddington's competency strategy had been calculated. It made me wonder, did he truly believe Evelyn was confused, or was he just exceptionally skilled at spinning delusion into sympathy? The way Evelyn sobbed about Josh, only to flash that searing glare when the decision didn't go her way, made me question how much of her act she controlled, how much she truly believed, and how much she was simply willing to perform. There would be no clean ending, no perfect resolution, but we still had to try. We had to stand in that courtroom and speak our truth, hoping that 12 strangers could see through the lies and manipulation. We had to fight for Sam's safety and for the life we were trying so desperately to reclaim. Tomorrow, the final battle would begin. The morning of the trial brought an unexpected twist. My husband discovered a USB drive taped beneath our mailbox at the rental house. On it were hundreds of screenshots from Evelyn's private social media accounts, evidence of meticulous planning going back over a year. Someone had anonymously handed us something we never could have found on our own. The screenshots were chilling. Evelyn had been tracking my menstrual cycle by reading between the lines of my posts mentions of PMS, headaches, mood swings. She'd predicted when I might conceive and had begun outlining her kidnapping plan months before Sam even existed. One post showed her practicing diaper changes on dolls, timing herself to see how quickly she could dress and undress a baby. We took the USB drive straight to the prosecutor. She reviewed the contents with growing intensity. The metadata confirmed the screenshots were recent, suggesting that someone close to Evelyn, someone who had once supported her, had finally become uneasy with the depth of her obsession. Later that afternoon, while we were reviewing our testimony notes, my phone rang. The number was local and unfamiliar. I almost didn't answer, but instinct made me pick up. It was Evelyn's ex-husband. He told me he'd left the USB. After their divorce, he still had access to some of her accounts. He'd been monitoring her growing fixation, waiting, hoping it would pass. But it hadn't. And now, he wanted to testify. He described things he'd never reported before, a hidden nursery she'd decorated years earlier in their spare room, filled with clothes for a baby that didn't exist. He'd found fertility supplements stashed in the back of their bathroom cabinet, medications she'd been taking without his knowledge. The prosecutor immediately added him to the witness list. His testimony would be invaluable. It revealed Evelyn's delusions weren't new. This wasn't grief spiraling out of control. It was a years-long pattern of obsession and manipulation. It directly challenged my parents' narrative that this had all stemmed from a recent psychological break. But the following morning, as we prepared to leave for court, another blow struck. All 4 tires on our rental car had been slashed clean, deliberate cuts, not random vandalism. Security footage from a neighbor's camera captured a shadowy figure approaching the car around 3 a.m. But the image quality was too poor to confirm an identity. My husband called his brother to pick us up while I contacted the prosecutor. She told us to document everything. The timing was too exact to dismiss as coincidence, but without proof, it was yet another act of intimidation we couldn't legally confront. As we rode to the courthouse, our daughter sat between us, holding my hand tight. She had insisted on coming. We'd tried to shield her from the worst of it, but she wanted to stand with us. My mother-in-law stayed home with Sam. We had installed new locks, upgraded security cameras, and taken every precaution. The courthouse steps were crowded with Evelyn's supporters. They waved signs with her photo, chanting about justice and compassion. Some recognized us and began shouting. My husband blocked their view of our daughter as we pushed through the noise, ignoring accusations that we were destroying a grieving mother. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn sat calmly at the defense table. She had styled her hair like mine, worn a dress eerily similar to the one I'd worn in a photo from Sam's birth. The mimicry was nauseating, like she was trying to replace me. When she turned and spotted us, she smiled and mouthed something. I couldn't hear her, but I could read her lips. My baby. My parents sat behind her, rigid and silent in their approval. Their expressions were blank, their loyalty undeniable. Other relatives I hadn't seen in years filled the benches behind them, forming a wall of support for Evelyn. On our side sat my husband's family and a small group of close friends, the ones who had witnessed Evelyn's unraveling firsthand. Then the prosecutor stood. She opened with a powerful statement, clear, measured, and unshakable. She drew a line between grief and criminality, between heartbreak and harm. She laid out the evidence of premeditation, the social media tracking, the forged documents, the careful planning, the way Evelyn had endangered a medically fragile child without remorse. The trial had begun. The prosecutor framed Evelyn's actions not as a breakdown, but as a case of cold, calculated obsession. Her opening statement was precise and unwavering. This was not mental illness. It was intentional, methodical harm. Charles Reddington's opening argument, by contrast, focused entirely on Evelyn's past loss. He painted vivid, emotional scenes of the trauma she had endured, the baby she carried for 7 months, only to lose to violence. He claimed that her mind had splintered from grief, that she sincerely believed Sam was her son reborn, and that her actions, while extreme, were rooted in delusion, not malice. The first day of testimony centered on the technical evidence. The prosecutor presented the forged documents Evelyn had submitted, illustrating the degree of sophistication involved. A forensic expert explained how Evelyn had researched interstate kidnapping laws in depth, demonstrating that she knew full well she was breaking the law. Financial records showed Evelyn had been discreetly setting aside money for months, depositing small amounts into a hidden account her ex-husband knew nothing about. She withdrew every cent shortly before the kidnapping to fund her escape. The planning was meticulous. Still, Reddington spun it as the behavior of a grieving woman trapped in fantasy. Evelyn's ex-husband testified the next day. He spoke about years of troubling patterns. Evelyn's belief that every pregnant woman she saw was carrying her baby. He had found journals where she wrote elaborate plans to rescue her child from various acquaintances. But the most damning part came when he described an earlier incident, 5 years ago, when Evelyn showed up at a hospital claiming to be his sister's baby's mother. Security had intervened, and she left without escalation, but it had caused a permanent rift in the family. No one reported it. They hoped she'd get help. Then my mother took the stand, and her testimony was everything we expected and feared. She portrayed Evelyn as a devoted sister, driven to desperation by our so-called cruelty. She claimed we'd flaunted my pregnancy in Evelyn's face, deliberately triggering her trauma. She even implied we named Sam something similar to Josh just to torment her. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor dismantled her version. She showed the jury the text messages, my mother's own words, revealing her role in planning the abduction. When confronted, my mother backpedaled, insisting she had only wanted Evelyn to spend time with her nephew. She claimed she hadn't known how far Evelyn would take it. My father's testimony was shorter, but just as damaging. He insisted Evelyn didn't understand what she was doing, that she lived entirely in her delusion, truly believing Sam was her son. He asked the jury to show compassion, to recognize mental illness, not criminality. Then came the moment the prosecutor had been preparing for the security footage. It was devastating. The jury watched Evelyn enter our home on multiple occasions in the weeks before the kidnapping, always in the dead of night. She never took anything, never woke Sam. She was rehearsing, testing, practicing. The footage from the night she finally took him showed a terrifying level of precision. No panic, no hesitation, just chilling, practiced efficiency. When I took the stand, I focused on the facts. I described finding Sam on the verge of death, his body shutting down from dehydration. I presented his medical records, detailing just how close we came to losing him. I outlined the security measures we'd been forced to take since, and the daily fear we now lived under. Reddington's cross-examination was ruthless. He questioned my decision to distance Evelyn from our family. He asked why I'd refused to let her be part of Sam's life. He implied that I had been jealous of the sympathy Evelyn received after her loss, that I'd gotten pregnant to eclipse her grief. But I didn't let him provoke me. I answered every question clearly, calmly, factually. I described how Evelyn's behavior had escalated from calling herself Mama to trying to breastfeed Sam, to violating boundaries we never thought we'd need to spell out. We didn't cut her out without reason. We were protecting our son. My husband's testimony echoed mine. He spoke of our daughter's fear, the nights she woke screaming, the financial strain of installing security systems, moving homes, changing jobs. He told the court how he had passed on promising work opportunities because we couldn't relocate until the trial ended. He described a family under siege. And then came the medical testimony. Sam's doctor laid it out with clinical clarity. She explained how close he had come to dying, how 12 more hours without fluids could have been fatal. She spoke about his ongoing health challenges, now worsened by trauma. His body was healing, but she couldn't yet say what the long-term effects might be. Evelyn's psychiatric evaluation was presented next. While the psychiatrist confirmed her diagnosis of delusional disorder, he also testified that she clearly understood the difference between right and wrong. Her careful planning, her use of forged documents, and her efforts to avoid detection all indicated that she knew what she was doing was illegal, even if she believed it was justified. On the final day of testimony, Evelyn took the stand. Her performance was eerily consistent. She referred to Sam exclusively as Josh, painting a vivid picture of the pregnancy she had lost and the overwhelming joy she felt when she found her baby again. She cried as she described the pain of being separated from him, but under cross-examination, her composure began to crack. When questioned about the fake paperwork, she doubled down, insisting the documents were real and accusing the prosecutor of lying. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence of her long-term planning, she became agitated, slipping between references to Sam and Josh as if they were different children entirely. The moment that likely sealed the jury's decision came when the prosecutor asked about Sam's near-fatal condition. Evelyn's response was chilling in its detachment. She insisted Josh had been just fine in her care, that the hospital must have done something to make him sick. There was no remorse in her voice, only frustration at having been separated from the child she believed was hers. During closing arguments, Charles Reddington made one last appeal for mercy. He asked the jury to consider Evelyn's trauma, her untreated mental illness, the system that had failed her after her loss. He portrayed her as a woman broken by grief, driven to desperate acts by abandonment and delusion. The prosecutor's closing was deliberate and devastating. She led the jury step by step through the evidence, the forged identity documents, the online research, the surveillance, the practice runs, the calculated choices. She reminded them that while mental illness could explain a person's behavior, it did not absolve them of accountability, especially when a child's life had been placed at risk. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I held my husband's hand so tightly, my fingers ached. When the foreman stood and began to read the verdict, I barely breathed. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, child endangerment, identity fraud, and interstate flight. The maximum sentence was 25 years. Evelyn's reaction was immediate and terrifying. She screamed that they were stealing her baby, that Josh needed her. She tried to lunge toward us, shrieking that a mother's love couldn't be stopped by prison bars. Bailiffs restrained her as she fought against them, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "I'll get him back. You can't keep us apart." My mother sobbed openly. My father glared at us with undisguised hatred. They left without a word, but their stance was clear. They hadn't just chosen Evelyn, they had left us behind. We had lost them completely. But we had protected our son. The sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. The judge acknowledged Evelyn's mental illness, but weighed it against the severity of her actions and the ongoing risk she posed. He sentenced her to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10 contingent on psychiatric treatment and proof of meaningful rehabilitation. We relocated to our new state the following week. The house sale had finalized, and my husband's new job was waiting. We told no one but his parents where we were going. Our daughter started at a new school, one where no one knew the weight she carried. Sam continued to thrive, hitting all his milestones with a strength that amazed his doctors. 6 months later, a new blow landed. We received legal notice that my parents were suing for grandparents' rights. They claimed we had unfairly alienated them and that they deserved access to our children. We hired a lawyer and began preparing for another fight. We were exhausted, but ready. We had faced worse. For now, though, we were safe. Sam slept soundly in his crib, unaware of the chaos that once surrounded him. Our daughter no longer checked the locks each night. My husband and I started to breathe again, to believe that maybe Evelyn couldn't reach us anymore. The trauma hadn't vanished. It was part of our history now, etched into our family's story. But we had survived. We had kept our children safe. And though we had lost so much, we still had each other.